The mist of the Scottish Highlands has a memory. Creeping through the valleys like a living thing, it hides secrets, keeps promises, and weaves destinies that not even the gods could undo. That morning, as Elspeth McKinney walked towards the castle, clutching an old suitcase in her trembling hands, the mist knew something she did not yet realize. Her life was about to change forever. Elspeth was not a woman of dreams. She was a woman of survival. Over the years, she had learned that beauty does not feed you, hard work does not guarantee anything, and a woman without an important surname is invisible to the world. So when she was offered a temporary job as a maid for a big wedding celebration at the castle, she didn't ask for details. She just accepted. She needed every coin as much as she needed air. The road to Grant Castle was treacherous. There were slippery stones, deep mud, and a stream swollen by recent rains. Elspeth walked carefully, but fate had other ideas. One false step, a muffled scream. Suddenly, the icy water engulfed her. The current dragged her away. Rocks battered her body. Panic stole her breath. For a terrible moment, she thought she would die there alone, unremembered. But then he appeared. A tall man emerged from the fog as if he were part of the storm itself. Without saying a word or asking permission, he simply rescued her. His strong hands pulled her from the water, and his firm arms held her as she trembled. Then, in a manner that contrasted with his imposing presence, he gently bandaged her injured wrist with a piece of cloth from his own clothing. He didn't say his name, nor did he wait for thanks. He simply told her to follow the path and not to stop, assuring her that she would arrive in time. Helpes obeyed, still in shock, her heart racing and her clothes soaked. She could barely see his face in the fog, but she would never forget his intense, dark eyes charged with a strength that seemed as ancient as the mountains. Hours later, when she arrived at Grant Castle, Elspeth took a deep breath and tried to concentrate. She needed this job. She couldn't afford to be distracted by thoughts of mysterious strangers. She entered through the service entrance, received some quick instructions, put on her maid's uniform, and prepared to start work. In the great hall, she saw the groom, Laird cum Grant, the same man who had saved her life that morning. Their eyes met across the room, which was filled with wedding preparations. Elspeth felt the ground disappear beneath her feet for the second time that day. But this time, there was no water to sweep her away. It was something much more dangerous. The recognition in cum Grant's eyes, and the impossible spark which had just been lit in her own heart. Before continuing with this story, please tell us in the comments which country you are joining us from. I love knowing how far our Highland romance stories reach. Leave your comment now. The morning had dawned in the Highlands like a cold, ancient wound. The fog descended from the mountains with the distinctive density unique to the Scottish Highlands, clinging to skin, thoughts, and memories one would rather forget. Elpes McKinney walked determinedly along the muddy path, clutching the handle of his old suitcase until his knuckles turned white. She wore no jewelry, carried no letters of recommendation from important families, only the essentials, clean clothes, patched shoes, and the kind of quiet hope that comes to those who have learned not to expect too much from life. That day, she was going to start work at Grant Castle. She had been told it was a big celebration, an important wedding. They needed extra staff to attend to the guests, serve the food, and keep everything spotless. The pay was decent, enough to cover the rent on her small village room for 2 more months, enough to buy food and keep her alive a little longer. For Elspeth, every coin had a name. Every day had a cat, and the bill never waited. The wind whipped her face and tore a strand of her long, wavy, wild, honey-colored hair. She was still young, barely 23, and there was a natural beauty in her features that no amount of hard work had completely erased. However, Elspeth had learned long ago that beauty means nothing without a surname to back it up or a dowry to offer. She was just another poor girl trying to survive in a world that would prefer her to be invisible. The path narrowed as it skirted a stream swollen from recent rains. Elspeth knew this trail well. She had walked it before when she occasionally worked on nearby farms. She knew to be careful of the slippery rocks and treacherous mud. But that morning, with the fog so thick that she could barely see 2 feet ahead, the rush to avoid being late and the weight of her worries bearing down on her, the path finally took its toll. It happened in an instant. A muddy edge gave way under her boot. Elspeth felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, and her body lurched forward with horrible inevitability. The suitcase slipped from her hands. She tried to grab hold of something, anything, but her fingers found only air and fog. Then the icy water hit her with such force that it knocked the breath from her. The stream, which had seemed calm from above, had become a whirlwind of force. When she fell into it, the current immediately swept her away, spinning her around and pushing her against the rocks. The cold was so intense that it felt as though thousands of needles were piercing her skin simultaneously. She tried to scream, but water filled her mouth. She tried to swim, but her soaked clothes dragged her down like anchors. The rocks at the bottom hit her knees, hands, and side. Panic is a living thing. It has claws and teeth. It takes over your mind, erasing all rational thought and leaving only pure, primitive terror. Elspeth felt that panic rising in her throat like a scream that wouldn't come out. The water carried her further and further from where she had fallen, towards a deeper part of the stream. Her lungs burned and her vision darkened. For one terrible moment, she thought, this is it. This is where my story ends. But then a firm, large, and sure hand appeared. A force that didn't ask for permission. A force that simply acted. Strong fingers closed around her arm, gripping her tightly, but saving her life. She felt herself being pulled from the water with incredible force, as if her rescuer had the strength of two men. Suddenly she was out of the water, coughing violently and shivering from the cold and shock, with mud mixing with the water dripping from her clothes. Through the palm and the tears that the cold had drawn from her eyes, she could barely see, but she made out a silhouette, a tall, imposing man with dark hair tied back. He was dressed in good quality clothes that were now also partially soaked from rescuing her. "Are you hurt?" His voice was deep and had that characteristic Highland accent which made every word sound like rough music. It wasn't exactly kind, but nor was it cruel. It was the voice of someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. Eleth tried to answer, but could only cough up more water. She was shaking so violently that her teeth were chattering. The man examined her efficiently, took her left hand, and frowned when he saw the cut on her wrist, which was bleeding and mixing with the water from the stream. Without saying another word, the stranger tore a strip of cloth from the inside of his shirt and quickly but carefully bandaged her wrist. Elsbeth watched him, feeling a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and embarrassment. She wasn't used to people helping her without expecting something in return. "Your suitcase," the man said suddenly. Before she could respond, he had walked downstream and retrieved the suitcase, which had become miraculously stuck between some rocks. He returned and handed it to her. Elspeth took it with trembling hands, not knowing what to say. For the first time, she could see his face clearly. He had sharp features, a strong jaw, and a small scar near his left eyebrow. But it was his eyes that struck her. They were dark and intense, with a depth that seemed to contain ancient stories. At that moment, they looked at her with a mixture of concern and something else that she couldn't identify. "Grant Castle is less than 2 kilometers down this road," he said, pointing ahead. "If you hurry, you'll arrive before the celebration begins. Go to the service entrance. Tell them you're early and ask for some dry clothes." Elspeth nodded, still unable to find her voice. She wanted to thank him, to ask his name and to find out why he had helped her. But before she could utter a word, the man had already begun to walk away, his figure fading into the mist as if he had never been there. "Wait," Els finally managed to say, her voice hoarse. "What? What's your name?" But even if he heard her, he didn't answer. He simply disappeared into the fire, leaving her alone on the road, soaked, shivering, and alive. Elspeth stood there for a moment longer, staring at the makeshift bandage on her wrist. The fabric had an interesting pattern of intertwining lines that was vaguely familiar to her, though she couldn't remember where she had seen it before. She filed this information away in the back of her mind, gripping her suitcase more tightly, and started walking towards the castle. The rest of the journey passed in a kind of mental fog and had nothing to do with the weather. Elspeth walked mechanically, one foot in front of the other, trying not to think about how close she had come to death, and how strange it was that a stranger had saved her without asking for anything in return. She tried not to think about the strange warmth she felt in her chest despite the cold that penetrated her bones. When Grant Castle finally emerged from the fog before her like a vision from another time, Elspeth stopped to gaze at it. It was imposing. Made of dark stone, it had towers rising towards the gray sky, Iron gates flanked by torches that burned even during the day, and tall, narrow windows that looked like eyes watching anyone who approached. It was the kind of place that reminded people of their place in the world, the powerful insight and the rest serving them. Elspeth took a deep breath, tightened her grip on her suitcase, and walked towards the service entrance as the stranger had instructed. A guard glanced at her indifferently, checked her name on a list, and nodded to let her pass. Inside, the castle was a hive of activity. Servants rushed back and forth with tablecloths, flowers, and silver trays. A stern-looking woman in an immaculate apron seemed to be directing everything with the precision of a general in battle. When she saw Elspeth, soaked and shivering, she frowned deeply. "What on earth happened to you, girl?" "I fell into the stream, ma'am," Elspeth replied in a low voice. "But I made it on time and I can work. I just need some dry clothes." "Yes, I can see that. Come with me." The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Beatrice, the castle's housekeeper, led Elspeth through stone corridors to a small room where spare uniforms for the staff were kept. She handed Elspeth a simple black dress with a white apron, stockings, and shoes. "Change quickly," she ordered, "and then go straight to the kitchen. We need all hands on deck. The ceremony is this afternoon, and Lord Grant will not tolerate any mistakes." Elspeth changed, her fingers still numb from the cold. The uniform fit her reasonably well, although the dress was slightly long. She pulled her hair into a tight bun, washed her face in the basin in the room, and tried to compose herself. When she looked in the small mirror on the wall, she saw a pale girl with dark circles under her eyes. At least she no longer looked like she had nearly drowned. Following Mrs. Beatrice's directions, she found the kitchen, a huge, chaotic space filled with delicious smells and frenetic activity. She was given simple tasks to begin with: carrying trays from the kitchen to the great hall, folding napkins and polishing cutlery. Elspeth worked quietly, keeping her head down and moving with the efficiency that comes with years of hard work. It was during one of those trips from the hallway to the great hall that it happened. Elspeth entered the hall with a tray of crystal glasses, focused on not tripping and not breaking anything. The hall was magnificent, with high ceilings adorned with dark wooden beams, a huge fireplace in which a bright fire burned, and antique tapestries depicting scenes of battles and hunting hanging on the walls. Well-dressed men conversed in small groups, elegant women supervised floral arrangements, and musicians tuned their instruments in a corner. And then, in the center of it all, she saw Come Grant, the Lord, the Groom, the same man who had saved her life that morning. The world seemed to stop. The conversations around her became a distant murmur. The fire in the hearth seemed to burn more slowly. Even the temperature of the air changed. Elspeth stood frozen in the middle of the great hall, the tray trembling slightly in her hands, as she stared at the man she now knew to be Callum Grant, lord of the Grant clan and of this castle, and apparently the groom at the wedding for which she had been hired. He saw her too. It was not the casual glance a lord might give a servant in his own castle. It was an immediate, complete recognition that crossed the distance between them like a bolt of lightning. Callum's dark eyes met Elspeth's, and in them she saw surprise and recognition, as well as something else she dared not name. For what seemed like an eternity, they stared at each other across the crowded hall. Elspeth felt her heart beating so loudly that she was sure everyone could hear it. Callum had interrupted his conversation with a group of older men. The maid who had just entered the hall had captured his complete attention. It was Lady Beatrice who broke the spell. "Girl, what are you standing there like a statue for? Those glasses aren't going to clean themselves. Get moving." Alette blinked and looked away from Callum, then hurried to fulfill her task. She placed the glasses on the main table with slightly trembling hands, keeping her head down and trying to become invisible, as she knew she should. But she could feel Callum's eyes on her. It felt like a physical weight on her tongue, a constant pressure that made every movement feel clumsy and exaggerated. When she had finished, she turned to leave the room, but couldn't help glancing quickly back at where Callum was standing. He was still watching her, though now he was pretending to pay attention to the conversation around him. His eyes found hers again, and for a moment Elspeth saw something in them that made her heart beat faster. Interest, but not the kind of predatory interest that some powerful men showed towards vulnerable women. It was something different, deeper and more dangerous. Elspeth fled the room as if ghosts were chasing her. Back in the kitchen, she tried to concentrate on her tasks, but her mind wouldn't cooperate. Why hadn't she told him who she was that morning? Why was the Lord walking alone on that path in the fog? And why had he looked at her like that in the hallway? As if she mattered. "Don't be silly," she muttered to herself as she peeled potatoes. "You're just a temporary servant. He's a lord about to get married. The fact that he saved your life is just an example of basic decency. Don't invent stories where there aren't any." But her heart, that treacherous organ, wouldn't listen to reason. The hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Els kept busy, which was a good thing because it gave her less time to think. She helped in the kitchen, brought more supplies to the living room, polished more silverware, and folded more napkins. Mrs. Beatrice was demanding but fair. Elset earned her approval by working hard without complaining. It was during one of her comings and goings that she met some of the other servants. There was a young girl named Maggie with rosy cheeks and an easy laugh who had worked at the castle for 3 years. While they were taking a short break with a cup of tea, it was Maggie who told her more about the wedding that was to take place that afternoon. "It's an arranged marriage," Maggie said quietly, looking around to make sure no one important was listening. "Between Lear Callum Grant and Lady Rowena Campbell. Their families had agreed to it years ago to strengthen the alliance between the clans." He felt something twist in his stomach. "They've known each other for a long time. Oh yes. They grew up seeing each other at clan gatherings and so on. They're both from good families." But Maggie leaned closer, lowering her voice even more. "Apparently neither of them is particularly happy with the arrangement. Lear Callum is doing his duty, as always. And Lady Rowena, well, there are rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Maggie looked around again. "They say her heart belongs to another, Laird's brother, Hamish Grant, in fact. But Hamish is the second son, you see. He doesn't have the title or the lands. So Lady Rowena was betrothed to Callum instead." Elspeth absorbed this information with a mixture of emotions she didn't want to examine too closely. It was a loveless marriage, a duty, and an obligation between powerful families. For some reason, that made it all feel even sadder. And Lord Callum asked, trying to sound casual, "He wants to marry her." Maggie shrugged. "LD never talks about his personal feelings. He's a man of duty. He always has been. Since taking the title 5 years ago after his father's death, he has put the needs of the clan above everything else. If his advisors and family decided that this marriage was best for the clan, then he would agree to it. That's how it works for people like them." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Beatrice, who sent them back to work. But Maggie's words echoed in Elspeth's mind. A man of duty, always putting the needs of the clan first, marrying someone not for love, but because it was expected of him. This was so different from her own life, where the only expectation was to survive another day. And yet somehow it sounded just as sad. Time flew by, and soon it was noon. Guests began to arrive in greater numbers, nobles from neighboring clans, family and friends. The castle filled with voices and laughter, and the sound of boots on stone floors. Elspeth moved among the shadows, doing her job invisibly as she was supposed to. But every time she entered the great hall, her eyes sought Callum of their own accord, and every time she found him already looking at her. It was disconcerting, exciting, and terrifying all at once. She didn't understand what it meant, but she knew it meant something. It was during one of these visits to the hall that she finally saw Lady Rowena Campbell. Rena was everything Elspeth was not. She was elegant, with perfect posture that spoke of years of training in ladylike behavior. Her dark hair was pulled back into an elaborate style adorned with sparkling pearls. Her dress was made of dark green silk and was embroidered with delicate gold thread. She was beautiful in a classic, refined way, the kind of beauty that belonged in tapestries and family portraits. However, there was something in her eyes that caught Elspeth's attention, a certain sadness or perhaps resignation. It was as if she was carrying an invisible weight that no one else could see. Rowena stood next to Callum, smiling politely as they conversed with a group of guests. They made a stunning couple. Elspeth had to admit it. Callum with his imposing height and natural air of leadership, and Rena with her grace and refined beauty. They looked perfect together, like figures from a fairy tale. But fairy tales don't have that subtle tension Elspeth could sense, even from a distance. The way Callum and Rowena stood close together, yet didn't really touch. The way their smiles didn't reach their eyes. The way they seemed to be acting their parts rather than living them. Then Elspeth noticed something else. Rena was occasionally glancing across the room at a young man standing and talking to a different group. He was shorter than Callum, with lighter hair and softer features, but there was an unmistakable family resemblance. This must be Hamish Grant, the younger brother. When Rena looked at him, her expression changed completely. For a fraction of a second, the mask of courtesy slipped, revealing something raw and real beneath. Longing, pain, love. Elspeth understood in that moment that Maggie was right. Rowena Campbell loved Hamish Grant, but that afternoon she would marry his older brother out of a sense of duty. This revelation stirred a complex mix of emotions within her. She felt compassion for Regina, who was trapped in a loveless marriage, sadness for the situation as a whole, and if she was honest with herself, a small, shameful glimmer of hope. But hope for what? That the marriage wouldn't take place? That somehow, miraculously, she, a nameless servant, could matter to a lord? "You're being ridiculous," she told herself firmly. "Finish your work and leave, that's all." But fate apparently had other plans. As Elspeth left the great hall with an empty tray, she passed close to where Callum was standing. It was completely accidental, simply the most direct route back to the kitchen. However, as she passed him, Callum moved slightly as if to stop her or speak to her. Their eyes met again, and this time Elspeth could clearly see what was in them. Recognition, yes, but also conflict, desire and confusion. It was an internal battle that mirrored her own. "Excuse me, my lord," Elspeth murmured, lowering her head and hurrying past. But she had sensed something change in that brief moment, something intangible yet undeniable. And she knew with a terrifying certainty that this day would not end as she had planned. The afternoon moved inexorably towards the ceremony. Elspeth tried to lose herself in her work, clinging to simple tasks like a shipwreck survivor clings to a plank at sea. She cleaned surfaces that were already clean, rearranged flowers that were already perfectly arranged, and counted cutlery that didn't need counting. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind away from dangerous thoughts. But the heart is a stubborn muscle that doesn't understand logic. Every time she saw Callum, even from afar, she felt a stirring in her chest. It wasn't just gratitude for saving her, although that was part of it. It was something more complicated and profound. It was the way his eyes sought her out in the crowded hall, as if she were the only person who mattered. The way his expression softened slightly when their gazes met, revealing the man behind the title. The way he seemed to be struggling with an internal battle that Elspeth recognized because she was fighting the same one. It was dangerous, impossible, and completely inappropriate. And yet the feeling grew with every passing hour. Elspeth knew she should be more careful. In a castle full of watchful eyes, rumors could destroy reputations in minutes. She, being who she was, a temporary servant with no protection or connections, would be the first to be blamed if anyone noticed anything inappropriate. Despite her best efforts to remain invisible and blend in with the other servants, however, she felt that something had changed irrevocably. And she wasn't the only one who felt it. Rena Campbell had noticed the way Crumb looked at the honey-haired maid. She wasn't stupid and had spent enough time at court among the nobility to recognize signs of attraction, even when they were being hidden. There was tension in Crumb's shoulders every time Elspeth entered the room. He was distracted when she was nearby. There was a conflict in his eyes that Rena had never seen before. Curiously, Rena didn't feel jealous. In fact, she felt something closer to understanding. After all, she knew better than anyone what it was like to love someone you couldn't have, to be trapped by duty, family expectations, and clan politics and alliances. Watching Hamish Grant from across the room, Rowena felt that same conflict and painful longing. So, when she saw the way Callum looked at the maid, she recognized her own divided heart in him, and that gave her hope in some strange way. The bandage on Elspeth's wrist had loosened slightly while she worked. During a brief break, she went to a quiet hallway to adjust it. As she did so, she studied the fabric more closely for the first time. The pattern was distinctive, intertwining lines in dark green and blue, with small white threads forming a geometric design. It was beautiful in a simple way, and clearly high quality. There was something familiar about it, but Elspeth couldn't quite place it. As she returned to the kitchen, she passed a coat rack in one of the service corridors, on which several garments belonging to the castle's inhabitants were hung. On a cloak that was clearly made of callum, based on its size, she saw the same pattern, the same tartan, the same lines, colors, and texture. Elspeth stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the cloak and then at the bandage on her wrist. They were exactly the same. The realization hit her like a silent thunderclap. The man in the mist and Lear Grant were one and the same person, something she had already realized when she saw him in the hall. This meant that Cum had recognized her from the moment he first saw her in the castle. His attention was neither accidental nor fleeting. He knew exactly who she was, the woman he had saved that morning, and yet he looked at her that way. Elspeth felt as if the air in the hallway had become too thick to breathe. Her emotions were a whirlwind. She felt joy because Callum remembered her, recognized her, and seemed to care about her in some way, but also terror because nothing good could come of this. She was confused because she didn't understand what he expected of her or what she wanted. She didn't know what could possibly be meant by a relationship between someone like him and someone like her. Leaning against the cold stone wall, she closed her eyes and tried to sort out her thoughts. But before she could fully process her feelings, she heard voices approaching down the hallway. Elspeth instinctively hid in a small alcove, not wanting to be seen in such an emotional state. The voices grew clearer, and with a start, she recognized one of them. It was Callum. "I can't go on with this, Hamish. It's unfair to everyone." "Unfair." Hamish's voice sounded tense. "Callum, this was settled years ago. Families depend on this alliance. What has changed?" There was silence. Elspeth held her breath, her heart beating so loudly that she feared they could hear it. "Everything has changed," Callum finally said, his voice low but intense. "This morning I met someone, and for the first time in my life, I felt something I'd never felt before." "But Callum, your wedding is in a few hours. What on earth happened this morning?" "I saved a woman's life in the creek, and when I looked at her, I felt something I'd never felt before. Now she's here in this castle, working as a maid at my own wedding. Every time I see her, I feel like I'm betraying something I didn't even know existed." Hamish let out a long sigh. "Irina, you've been thinking about her constantly because she deserves better. She deserves someone who will love her properly. And you know as well as I do that that person is not me." Another silence. "Callum, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I don't know. I still don't know, but I need time to think and talk to Rowena. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us being honest about what we want, rather than what we're told we should want." The footsteps receded, and their voices faded into the distance. Elspeth remained in her hiding place, trembling. She had overheard something private and important that could be dangerous. Cullum had told her that he had feelings for her, that every time he saw her, he felt like he was betraying something, and that he had never felt anything like this before. But the joy those words should have brought was mixed with pure panic because Elspeth knew better than anyone that feelings don't change reality. Calum was a lord. She was a servant. He had responsibilities to his clan and obligations that had been established long before she came into his life. She, on the other hand, was nobody. She had nothing to offer except trouble. When she finally emerged from her hiding place, Elspeth had made a decision. She would leave after the ceremony, take her payment, and disappear. It was the only sensible option. The only one that would prevent the destruction of lives, the causing of scandals, and the ruining of alliances between clans and families. Kaloum would marry Rena as planned. Duty would prevail over sentiment, and she would become a memory, perhaps even just a footnote, in the story of the day a lady saved a woman from the stream. It was the right thing to do. It had to be the right thing. However, as Elspeth returned to her duties, she couldn't ignore the small voice in her heart that whispered, "What if it doesn't have to be this way?" The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. Elspeth worked mechanically, responding to orders and completing tasks while maintaining her mask of an obedient and invisible servant. Inside, however, her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She saw Rena talking briefly with Hamish in a corner of the hall, their heads bent together and their expressions intense. She saw the way Rowena looked at him, her longing so pure and painful that it cut through the air. She saw the way Hamish looked back at her, his eyes filled with the same longing and the same sense of impossibility. Two people who loved each other but couldn't be together. Then there was Callum, moving through the castle with his lordly presence, talking to guests and overseeing preparations as the perfect host. But Elspeth could see the tension in his shoulders and the distraction in his eyes. And every time their eyes met accidentally across the room, she felt that same flash of connection and recognition of something bigger than either of them. The sun began to descend, the shadows in the castle lengthened. The musicians began to play soft, preliminary melodies. The guests gathered in the great hall dressed in their finest attire, preparing to witness the union of two powerful families. Elspeth, standing in the shadows in her maid's uniform, felt her heart break silently for a life she had never had the chance to live. The day of the ceremony dawned with a strange light. The sun filtered through the lingering fog, creating golden rays that made the castle look otherworldly. Its beauty was supernatural, the kind that makes people believe in magic and destiny. Elspeth had not slept well. She had spent the night in the small room she shared with the other temporary maids, tossing and turning on her narrow cot and wrestling with decisions and emotions that seemed too big for her simple life. She had decided to leave after the ceremony. That decision was made. But in the dark hours before dawn, as she listened to the steady breathing of the other sleeping women, she allowed herself to briefly dream of the impossible. What if Callum didn't marry Rowena? What if there was a way for everyone to find true happiness? What if the destiny that began with a rescue in the fog had a different ending to the one she had imagined? But with the light of day, those dreams vanished like mist in the sun. Elspeth got up, put on her uniform, tied her hair back, and prepared for what she knew would be one of the most difficult days of her life. The castle was at its peak of activity. More guests had arrived during the night. The great hall had been transformed into a ceremonial space adorned with flowers, candles, and silk ribbons in the colors of the Grant clan. Everything was perfect and impeccable, prepared with the precision expected of an event of this magnitude. Elspeth moved among the crowd of servants, doing her assigned tasks and keeping her head down. However, her treacherous eyes kept searching for Callum. She had seen him earlier that morning, walking through the castle grounds with Hamish. The two brothers were talking intently, their heads bent together. From a distance, Elspeth couldn't hear their conversation, but she could sense the tension in their body language and the gravity of their discussion. Then she saw Rena sitting alone in one of the castle's inner gardens. Despite her perfect posture and immaculate attire, she appeared vulnerable that morning, almost defeated, as if she had accepted her fate yet still mourned what might have been. The hours passed, and the time of the ceremony drew nearer. The guests began to gather in the great hall, taking their places according to rank and family relationship. There was an air of anticipation, but also something else that Elspeth couldn't quite identify, as if everyone were waiting not just for a wedding, but for something bigger and more unpredictable. Elspeth stood at the back of the hall, near the doors leading to the service corridors, ready to assist with anything that might be needed during the ceremony. From there, she had a clear view of the makeshift altar where Callum and Rowena would soon stand and promise their lives to each other. The thought made her throat tighten painfully. Then, finally, the moment arrived. The musicians switched to a more formal, ceremonial melody. The murmurs of conversation in the hall fell silent. All eyes turned towards the main entrance. Callum entered first, walking with a natural presence that seemed to make the air around him feel thicker. He wore his clan's full tartan kilt, with that familiar pattern of intertwining lines. He wore a dark jacket with silver detailing and a ceremonial sword at his side. He looked exactly as he was, a powerful, imposing Highland lord, born to lead. But his eyes were searching. They swept across the room, passing over the faces of nobles and relatives, until they found what they were looking for. Elspeth, standing in the shadows at the back of the room. Their eyes met, and the world shrank down to just the two of them. Two people, separated by a room full of people and by the distance of their positions in life, by expectations and duty. And yet, in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was their connection, their recognition of each other, and the feeling that neither of them could deny. Elspeth saw something change in Callum's face. She saw determination solidify. She saw him make a decision in real time. Then Rhina entered, and everyone's attention shifted to her. She was beautiful, of course. She wore a white silk dress with intricate silver embroidery. Her hair was elaborately styled. Family jewels sparkled around her neck and wrists. She was the perfect picture of a noble Highland bride. But Elspeth, watching carefully, noticed things that others might have missed. She noticed the slight stiffness in Rena's shoulders, in the way her eyes briefly searched for and found Hamish in the crowd before turning to Caleb. She noticed the small pause in her step, as if part of her wanted to turn and run away. Rowena walked to the altar where Callum waited. She stood before him. The priest who was going to conduct the ceremony cleared his throat, ready to begin. Then Callum did something no one expected. He raised a hand, stopping the priest before he could say anything. "Wait," said Callum, his deep voice echoing in the suddenly silent hall. "Please wait." He turned to look directly at Rena, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft yet clear so that everyone could hear him. "Lady Rowena Campbell, you have honored me with your presence here today, and our families have placed their faith in this union. But before we proceed, I need to ask you a question, and I ask that you answer with complete honesty." Rena stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise and something else. "Perhaps hope. Is this the marriage your heart desires? Not what duty dictates and not what our families expect, but what you, Rena Campbell, truly want." The hall seemed to hold its breath collectively. This was not how ceremonies were supposed to proceed. It was scandalous, unpredictable, and real. Rowena looked at Callum, then she swept her gaze over the crowd of guests. She met Hamish's eyes, and in that moment, something broke inside her. The mask of perfect composure cracked, revealing the real woman beneath. She spoke. At first, her voice was barely a whisper, but it grew louder. "No, this is not what my heart desires." Murmurs of shock rippled through the room, but Callum only nodded. It was as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. "Then we will not do it," he said simply. "I have learned something recently. I have learned that duty without heart is but an elegant prison, and none of us should live in prisons." He turned to the crowd, his presence commanding and silencing the murmurs. "This marriage was arranged with the best of intentions, to strengthen alliances and unite families. I deeply respect those intentions, but marriage requires more than good intentions. It requires love, mutual respect, and a genuine desire to share a life. Lady Rowena and I have great respect for each other, but we do not have that." Hamish began to move through the crowd, walking forward. His face showed a mixture of hope and fear. Callum saw him and smiled slightly. "My brother Hamish, however, loves Lady Rowena, and she loves him. Anyone can see that, so I propose something different." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I propose that this celebration continues as planned, that the families unite and the alliances are strengthened. But the marriage should be between the right people, Hamish Grant and Rowena Campbell, two people who truly choose each other." The room exploded with conversation. Some guests looked scandalized, while others looked intrigued. The older members of the families looked at each other, assessing and calculating. It was Rena's father who finally rose from his seat and spoke. "El Grant," he began, "this is highly unusual." "I know, Lord Campbell," he replied, "and I apologize for the surprise, but ask yourself this. Would you rather your daughter be in a loveless marriage or find true happiness, even if it's not exactly what we had planned?" Lord Campbell looked at his daughter and saw the tears in her eyes and the way she looked at Hamish. Something softened in his expression. "Rowena," he said softly, "is this what you want?" "Yes, father," she replied, her voice breaking. "With all my heart." There was a long moment of silence. Then Lord Campbell nodded slowly. "Then so be it." What followed was a chaotic but joyful reorganization. Instead of Callum and Rowena, Hamish and Rowena would marry. The ceremony would go on, but with the right participants. After the initial shock, the families began to see the wisdom in this. Although Hamish was the second son, the alliance would still be maintained. More importantly, there was now a genuine joy that had not been there before. As everyone regrouped, Caleb left the hall. Elspeth saw him leave, hesitated for a moment, then followed him. She found him in the courtyard, standing under the gray sky and looking at the mountains in the distance. "Did you come to tell me I'm a fool?" he asked, not turning around. "I came to—" "I don't know why I came," Elspeth admitted. Caleb turned to look at her. "I came to find you this morning. You were gone." "I was going to leave after the ceremony," Elspeth said. "I thought it would be easier that way." "Easier for whom? For everyone? For you? For this? It doesn't make sense, my lord. You're a lord and you're the woman who changed everything." Caleb interrupted her. "In that moment, in the fog, when I pulled you out of the water and looked at you, something in me woke up. It had been asleep for so long that I had forgotten it existed." "But I don't want promises now," Callum said softly. "I don't want to pressure you into being something you're not. I just want to get to know you and understand who you are beyond those 5 minutes in the fog. Will you give me that chance?" Elspeth felt tears burning in her eyes. Her clan expects her to marry someone appropriate, someone of her class. My clan expects me to be a good leader. A good leader knows that personal happiness matters too. I can't guide others to better lives if I can't honor my own truth. He reached out his hand to her, not like a lord giving orders, but like a man making a request. Elspeth looked at his outstretched hand, feeling the weight of the moment. She could take his hand and step into the unknown, or turn away and return to the safety of what she knew, the predictable and invisibility. From inside the castle came the sounds of music. The ceremony between Hymus and Rowena had begun. There was laughter, celebration, and joy. Elspeth took Callum's hand. The days following Hamish and Rowena's wedding were strange for everyone at Grand Castle. After all, it wasn't every day that a ceremony changed participants at the last minute, that a lord publicly renounced an arranged marriage, or that the second son suddenly became the center of a political alliance. But after the initial shock had passed, a kind of peace settled over the castle. Hamish and Rowena were radiant with happiness. They made no attempt to hide their love, and even the most cynical person would admit that Hamish had done the right thing by seeing them together. A marriage should look like this, not like a business arrangement, but like a union of hearts. However, Calumcum had to face the consequences of his decision. The clan elders were not entirely pleased. There were long, tense meetings and discussions about responsibility and duty. They reminded Calum that, as Lairdus, his personal life was not entirely his own and that he would eventually need to marry and produce heirs to ensure the continuity of the clan. Callum listened respectfully but did not back down. "I will marry when I find someone with whom I can build a real life," he told them, "not before." When some of the elders pressed him, asking if he had already found someone, he simply smiled and changed the subject because Elspeth was still there, not just as a temporary servant. This had come to an end with the conclusion of the wedding celebrations, but she had not left the castle as planned. Instead, in one of those strange and wonderful conversations that change lives, Lady Beatrice had offered her a permanent position. The castle always needed good workers, she said, and Els had proven herself to be reliable and diligent. Els suspected that Calumum had had something to do with the offer, but she didn't ask. She simply accepted because deep down she knew she wasn't ready to leave yet, not when something fragile yet real was blossoming between her and Calum. They saw each other in stolen moments, in quiet corridors after the castle had fallen asleep, in the garden early in the morning before the day's duties began, and in the library where Calum taught her to read better. They shared books, stories, and comfortable silences. It was a kind of secret courtship, though not as secret as they thought. The servants noticed, the guards noticed, probably the whole castle noticed. But there was one important difference. No one judged them harshly, perhaps because they had seen what Callum's honesty had achieved with Hymish and Rowena. Or perhaps they respected their lord enough to trust his judgment. Or perhaps it was because of the way Callum looked at Els, which made even the most skeptical person want to believe in fairy tales. "It can't last," Elspeth Callum told him one night as they walked along the castle walls under a starry sky. "Eventually, your clan will demand that you marry someone more suitable. You know, I'm not. I have no title. I have no lands. You have something no woman of title or lands has ever had. Callum interrupted her. You have my heart. Elspeth stopped and turned to look at him. Don't say that unless you mean it. I mean it completely. Callum took her hands and held them between his. Elspeth McKenny, I don't know exactly how this works. I don't know how to convince my clan that you're the right choice. I don't know what challenges we'll face, but I do know one thing. From the moment I pulled you out of the stream and our eyes met in the hall, my life changed. I don't want it to go back to the way it was before, Elspeth McKenny. Callum. Elspeth felt tears welling up in her eyes. I'm not like Rena. I don't know how to be a lady. I don't know how to behave at court or talk to nobles. But then we'll learn together. Rena has offered to help you, you know. She likes you. She says you have a strong spirit and that you don't let the world crush you, despite all the reasons it has to treat on. Rena said that. Callum smiled. She went through her own awakening. She knows what it's like to be torn between duty and desire, and she's on our side. In the months that followed, Els did indeed begin to learn. Now happily settled as Hamish's wife, Rina took Elset under her wing. She taught her etiquette and how to move in noble circles, as well as how to speak with confidence without seeming conceited. Rena didn't try to change Elspeth's core personality. She simply provided her with the tools to navigate a world that had previously been closed to her. Maggie and the other maids who had become Elspeth's friends supported her, celebrated her successes, and helped her practice. There was a sense that everyone in the castle was invested in this unlikely love story and wanted it to succeed. The clan elders remained skeptical, but even they began to soften when they saw how Elset was blossoming. Laird had always been a capable leader, but now there was something more. A joy and energy that hadn't been there before. He made better decisions, listened more attentively, and cared more deeply for his people. A happy lord is a better lord, one of the elders remarked to another during a council meeting. Perhaps the boy knew what he was doing after all. Not everything was easy, of course. There were rumors. Some said Callum was being foolish, putting desire above duty, and would eventually regret it. Nobles tried to push their daughters on Callum, insisting that he needed a suitable marriage. But Callum stood his ground, and slowly over time, the resistance began to dissipate. The turning point came almost a year later. During the annual clan meeting, all the important members of the Grant clan gathered to discuss matters, resolve disputes, and celebrate traditions. It was the most important event of the year, and all eyes would be on come. Elspeth had spent weeks preparing and rehearsing with Rowena, trying not to let her nerves overwhelm her. She knew that this would be a test, a public declaration of who she was and what she meant to Callum. When the time came, Elspeth entered the great hall on Callum's arm, wearing a beautiful gown that Rena had made for her. It wasn't as elaborate as Rena's, but it was good quality and elegant in its simplicity. The hall fell silent as they entered. Hundreds of eyes watched them, judging and evaluating. Callum led Elspeth to the front of the hall. Then he turned to face his clan. Members of the Grant clan, he began, his voice resonating with authority. This past year has been one of change. Changes that some of you have questioned. Changes that challenged our traditions. But today, I want to talk to you about positive change. He paused, letting his words sink in. Our clan was built on strength, loyalty, and honor, but also on something more fundamental. Families, love and the bonds that strengthen us, not because they are politically advantageous, but because they are genuine. He took Elsa's hand and held it high for all to see. Elsa McKinney saved me without even knowing it. She saved me from a life of heartless duty and a loveless marriage. She saved me from becoming the kind of leader who knows only obligation and no joy. And today, in front of all of you, I declare my intention to marry her. There was a collective murmur of surprise, disapproval, and support. I know some will think this is inappropriate, Cum continued, that as a lord, I should marry someone with a title, land, or political connections. But I ask you this, what makes a good marriage? Is it title, or is it mutual respect, admiration, and true love? Hamish stood up in the crowd. My brother speaks with wisdom, he said loudly. I have found true happiness in my marriage to Rena precisely because it was not forced. It was chosen. And I see that same happiness in Crumble with Elspeth. We would deny our Lord what we so readily approved for me. Rowena joined him, standing up as well. Elspeth McKinney has proven herself to be a woman of character, strength, and dignity. She has learned our customs with grace. She treats everyone in this castle with respect, regardless of rank. It would be an honor to have her as part of our family. One by one, others began to stand up too. These included Lady Beatrice, who had seen Elspeth work hard day after day, Maggie and the other maids who knew her best, the guards, who had observed her kindness, and the families who had seen the positive change in their laird. Finally, one of the clan's oldest elders stood up. This man had known Callum's father and grandfather. "LeGrant," he said in a trembling but clear voice, "your grandfather once told me that the true strength of a leader is not measured by the battles they win, but by the happiness they bring to their people. You have brought happiness. You have brought positive change. You have shown that honor does not mean sacrificing everything personal, but finding the right balance." He looked around the hall, then back at Callum and Elspeth. "If this woman brings joy to our leader, if she makes him a better leader and has earned the respect of those who know her, then who are we to object to the Grant clan blessing this union?" The hall erupted in applause. Not everyone was convinced. There were some skeptics who would never fully approve. But enough of the right people, enough of the majority, could see the truth right in front of them. Elspeth felt tears running down her cheeks. Callum pulled her towards him and kissed her in front of his entire clan. It wasn't a ceremonial kiss. It was real, full of promise, joy, and relief. When they finally broke apart, Elspeth whispered, "Is this really happening? This is really happening," Callum whispered back. The wedding was planned for 3 months later, giving Elspeth time to prepare thoroughly. Rena helped with every detail, from the dress to the traditions she needed to know about. Lady Beatrice made sure that everything in the castle was perfect. Hamish joked that this time, the wedding would involve the right people from the outset. On the wedding day, the sky was clear for the first time in months, as if the Highlands themselves were celebrating with them. Elspeth stood in the same hall where, months earlier, she had watched Calomim almost marry someone else and thought her heart would break. Now dressed in a beautiful white gown with wildflowers from the Highlands in her hair, she walked towards Callum, feeling only joy. Callum waited for her, smiling from ear to ear. When she reached his side, he took her hands and whispered, "Beautiful." The ceremony was perfect, traditional in the important ways, yet personal in the details that made it unique to them. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises that meant something because they came from the heart, rather than from tradition. When the priest declared them husband and wife, and Callum kissed her to the applause of those gathered, Elspeth knew with absolute certainty that her life had changed forever that day in the mist, only for the better. The years that followed were good, though not perfect. No life is perfect. There were challenges. They had to learn to balance personal love with clan duty. They had to navigate the complexities of Highland politics and occasionally face those who never fully accepted a former servant as the lady of the castle. But Elspeth and Callum faced these challenges together. She became a respected lady in her own right, known for her compassion towards the less fortunate, her practical approach to clan matters, and her ability to see beyond appearances to the heart of situations. Callum became one of the most respected lairds in the Highlands. He was known not only for his strength and wisdom, but also for his humanity. He reminded his people that life was about more than duty, that love mattered, and that happiness was not a luxury, but a necessity. Hamish and Rowena remained his closest allies and best friends. The four of them shared long, laughter-filled dinners, discussing everything from clan politics to the latest castle gossip. Their children grew up together as cousins who were as close as siblings. Sometimes on nights when the fog rolled down from the mountains, Callum and Elspeth would walk hand in hand around the castle grounds. They would visit the spot on the road where it had all begun, where a stranger had saved a woman from the stream. "Do you ever regret it?" Elspeth asked one such night. "What?" Callum replied, genuinely confused. "Everything. Canceling your first wedding and choosing me when you could have had someone more suitable." Callum stopped and turned her to face him. His dark eyes, which had captivated her from the very first moment, shone brightly in the moonlight. "Elspeth Grant," he said, "you are the most appropriate thing that has ever happened to me. You are my home, my heart, and my choice. I would choose you again every time without hesitation." He kissed her then, in the mist of the Highlands, where their lives had first intertwined. Elspeth, who had once been just a woman with an old suitcase and too many bills to pay, and who had thought that her life would always be about just getting by, knew that she had found something rarer and more precious than any title or wealth. True love. She had found true love. And in the Highlands, where the mist keeps secrets and the wind tells stories, that love became legend. It is the story of a servant girl and a lord who chose love over duty, who proved that destiny can strike at the most unexpected moments, and that true nobility comes not from birth, but from character. The mist eventually lifted, as it always does, but the love that had blossomed there remained forever. Did you enjoy this romantic tale set in the Highlands? If you enjoyed it and would like to read more stories full of excitement, true love, and unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe to Romance in the Highlands. Like daily if this story touched your heart. Share it with someone who loves historical romances. And let me know in the comments which part of the story was your favorite. Was it the rescue in the fog, the moment Cum stopped his own wedding, or Elspeth's happy ending? I'll see you in the next story where the Scottish mist will bring us a new romance. See you soon.